Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff McDonald, a professor at the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this, our final talk in our 10-year anniversary of the Distinguished Lecture Series. As always, I want to thank the Global Institute for Water Security and Global Water Futures Project for underwriting this seminar series, and recognize that as we gather here today, at least virtually, we're coming to you from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis, and we pay our respects to these First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another through our water research. As I mentioned, today is the last in the series, and I'm very thrilled that we can end with a bang with Megan Konar. Megan is coming to us from Oxford University, where she's on sabbatical this year, but Megan in normal times is an associate professor at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. She's in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and she's also director of the Center for Food System Security. And as you'll hear, this weaves something into her research as well, where she's really become, in the last 10 years since her PhD, an international thought leader in the area of food, water, and trade, and those interactions, and how hydrology links to environmental science and the economy. So it's not surprising. Megan's had many accolades for her work in the last few years. I'll only note a couple of them. The Walter Huber Civil Engineering Research Prize from the American Society of Civil Engineers. We recognized her at AGU as a early career award through the hydrologic science section. And she is the holder of an NSF Career Award through the National Science Foundation. Megan's been very active as a contributor to our hydrology efforts globally. She's deputy chair of the AGU Water Society and Technical Committee, and she's also associate editor of Water Resources Research. So Megan, thank you so much for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you now and look forward to your talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that lovely and very generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to participate and present here. This is really great, and I'm excited. So let me go ahead and share some slides. So today I'd like to talk with you about some of my work, bringing it together broadly, thinking about water resources with a particular focus on groundwater and food supply chains, which is what occupies a lot of my group's time. So I thought I would also just kind of briefly introduce myself. But yeah, for about the last 10 years, I've been a member of the faculty at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. And my group focuses on these topics, the relationship between water, food, and trade. And we try to do work that we hope can be useful for policy. So in particular, some of the methodological approaches or topics that we focus on are water footprints. So thinking about how much water is embedded in the goods that we use throughout society, that we require in our economy. In my group, we have a particular focus on agriculture and food goods. So here we're thinking about the water used throughout the production process of these items. So for agriculture, it's mostly the water that's evapotranspired in the field while those items are grown. But for then other things like animals, meat items, we think about all the feed that goes into their diet. We're also, in my group, interested in thinking about supply chains and international trade as complex networks. So we often use the statistical tools of complex networks to try to identify choke points or vulnerabilities in these complex systems. Another research theme of mine is causal inference. So this is where we're trying to use the tools of econometrics to figure out the causal impact of some policy intervention or treatment on an outcome of interest. And I won't really talk so much about this theme today, but I have some work where we've investigated the impact of crop insurance on water use or trade on water use, which would be happy to follow up with anybody who's interested in those topics. But so what are some of the research questions that motivate me and my students? So we're interested in trying to understand what the relationship between water resources and food supply chains broadly is. In particular, we want to know how food supply chains impact water use and how they impact the sustainability of how we use water resources. And then in turn, we're interested in how water impacts food supply chains, agricultural supply chains. So here, we're often thinking about water as a hazard to supply chains, both short-term hazards like droughts and floods, and longer-term risks like unsustainable water use, how that might pose a risk to our agricultural production and supply chains. Before I dive into some of the work today, I just wanted to acknowledge my students and collaborators who, I'm really presenting their work. These people have really led this work, and without them, I wouldn't be able to present this work. So thank you to all my students whose work I'll be sharing. And the way I typically like to organize my seminars is to have the first sort of theme break a little bit for a few questions in the middle, and then carry on with some more 2 mini seminars. So you don't have to hold your burning questions all the way to the end. I'll try to take a break in about 20 minutes, halfway through. So first I'll talk about this groundwater and agricultural supply chains. And then the second part, I'll hone in and talk about some of our recent work trying to actually map and model food supply chains themselves. So diving in here, this audience is very well versed in water resources and water security, but our water resources are very tightly coupled with agriculture and food production. And water footprints is one way that we can quantify and encapsulate that relationship between water and food production. So here in this talk, I'll talk a lot about water footprints, and I'm thinking about the water volume that's incorporated in a food product. So take this tomato, for example. It's not the water that I squeeze and get out of the tomato. It's all the water that goes into essentially evapotranspiring while that tomato is growing in the field. And then for more refined products like this chocolate bar or this cheeseburger, we would think about all the water that might go into refining processes, or some of the mass that's lost as we refine those goods. So more refined products tend to have a higher water footprint per unit of food. And there's also different sources of water. So in my group, we're spending a lot of time trying to think in particular about all the different types of water, the different costs, opportunity costs, and ways that agriculture relies on these different sources of water. So one main source is rainwater. So when thinking about agriculture, rainwater is very important because most food is actually still produced using rainfall. So rain-fed agriculture, there's a statistic down there, 60 to 70% of food produced around the world is rain-fed. But then food that's produced using irrigated water supplies, those are often called blue water supplies. So here we're thinking about water that we actually draw from a water body of some sort. So that could be surface water supplies, irrigating from lakes, dams, rivers, reservoirs. That's surface water. Groundwater is what I'll mostly focus on today. So that's when you're pumping water from the ground, bringing it to the surface. And you can think of sustainable groundwater supplies that you irrigate with, or also unsustainable groundwater, where you're pumping faster than the water can recharge into the aquifer. So agriculture from blue irrigated supplies tends to be more productive. You have higher yields typically when you're irrigating with blue water. And in turn, sort of most water use is actually for irrigation. It's for crop production. So there's a very tight interconnection between water and agriculture. And then thinking about groundwater in particular. So groundwater is already very important to society. So these are global fractions of how much each of these economic sectors relies on groundwater. So the groundwater for domestic water uses, about a third of that actually comes from groundwater. This is around the world, global average. Already irrigation in agriculture is about 42% of our irrigation supplies from groundwater. And groundwater is also important for industry. 27% of industry's water use comes from groundwater. And of course, these are global averages. So certain places, certain times, groundwater will be even more important. And groundwater is also projected to become more important going into the future. So in the future, if we do have increased variability in our rainfall patterns, increased variability in our surface water supplies, as is projected to occur with a changing climate, then groundwater is likely to be more important and more valuable, since it can be a stable stock or a bank of water that you're able to draw upon when you have less water available on the surface. So groundwater is likely to become more important going forward. And here I wanted to just acknowledge some of the great work that's come out of Saskatchewan, out of Jay McLeody's lab, where they've been actually using GRACE satellites to track groundwater depletion around the world, aquifer depletion. And so this is from some of their work where they look at how stocks of groundwater have been changing over time, helping us to identify some of those critical or hotspot aquifers, such as the one in northern India, Central Valley in California, and throughout the Northern Africa and Middle East. And here's, I'm going to focus mostly on the aquifers in the US. So the US, we do have groundwater depletion, unsustainable groundwater use in our aquifers as well. So this is a time series of groundwater depletion in the US over the last 100+ years, cumulative depletion. So the black line shows total unsustainable groundwater use. And you can see that it really picks up in around the 1940s, 50s, which coincides with the Green Revolution. So the Green Revolution is when we started really using inputs in agriculture like machinery, fertilizers, and irrigation. So that's when you see over-extraction of groundwater really pick up. And that's particularly true in a few aquifers. The High Plains Aquifer, which runs along the Eastern Rockies, the Gulf Coast Plain, which I'll also sometimes call the Mississippi Embayment, and the Central Valley in California, which I have a map of on the next slide. So these are the three aquifers where there's a lot of agricultural production in these locations, a lot of groundwater irrigation, and then corresponding, much of that groundwater irrigation is unsustainable. So we're going to focus on these aquifers for part of this talk. So in my group, we're wanting to understand, some of these questions. So what is the relationship between groundwater and supply chains, in agricultural supply chains in the United States? And then some of these questions in particular. So how does groundwater support our domestic supply chains and international exports in the United States? And then in turn, what is the mass and the financial value of those supply chains that relies on groundwater depletion? Because I think this question can help us identify that element of the supply chains that's at risk in the future of potentially having to be replaced from elsewhere or produced in a different way. And then how do these relationships change under drought? So under drought, it's likely that that's when there's not enough available surface supplies, both from rain and surface irrigation. So what does that mean for groundwater? We'll hone in on the first question first. So in a study, we combined a variety of government open source statistical information to try to see where the water that's being drawn upon in these aquifers, trace it around the country to where it's actually going to consumers incorporated in their food products. So, and then you can read, so each map, we trace the water from each aquifer individually. So the map for the Central Valley, for example, is showing where the groundwater pumped in the Central Valley used to produce agriculture, and then where those crops are distributed across the US for final consumers. So for example, lettuce and other fruits and vegetables grown in the Central Valley will then be shipped to Chicago eaten at picked up by the consumers at the grocery store there. And that would be what we call virtual water, where consumers in Chicago are receiving Central Valley water. And so here the states have been shaded darker red if they receive a lot of water from those aquifers, to yellow if they don't receive that much water from those aquifers. So you can see often the states overlying the aquifers themselves actually receive the most water because they're directly consuming a lot of the agricultural goods that are produced there. But also California sends a lot of crops to Texas, sends crops to Illinois and New York. And so, we as consumers in those places are, indirectly benefiting from the irrigation from Central Valley aquifer waters. We can also trace those groundwater resources abroad. So here we paired some domestic irrigation information, agricultural production, and trade data to trace where those aquifers are sending water to other countries. And so here, this is a circular network diagram. And so the way you can read it is you find the name of the aquifer. So the yellow is the High Plains Aquifer, for example. And then you can trace the largest link, and it goes over here to Mexico. So a lot of High Plains aquifer water is being incorporated in agricultural products that we're then exporting to Mexico. The same for the Mississippi embayment. So the largest link from the Mississippi embayment aquifer is also going to Mexico. So we do send a lot of agricultural produce to Mexico. Also, a lot of our agricultural products go to Asian countries. So you can get a sense of where we are exporting virtual water resources to countries around the world. 51% goes to Asian countries, and actually most of the groundwater exports are from the Mississippi embayment aquifer. And so then in turn, you can look at the amount of grain that relies on these water resources. And the grain supply of countries is one indicator of food security, because grain is an important part of our diet, very affordable. So you can see what percent of countries' grain supplies relies on these aquifers. So actually in the United States ourselves, 18% of our total grain supply comes from just these three aquifers. And these aquifers are important to the grain supplies of other countries as well. Taiwan, Japan, Panama get about 10% of their national grain supplies from these aquifers. So this highlights that they might be important to consider in food security strategies going forward, or we might need to consider diversifying away from these production locations as the groundwater becomes, if it becomes depleted. And so, what amount of mass or what value of agricultural crops would we have to replace? So what fraction relies on groundwater depletion? So to answer that question, we do have to use a hydrology model to figure out the unsustainable amount of groundwater, because we need to know information about the climate, how much is recharging, how much is evapotranspiring. So we need to keep track of all the flows and stocks in the hydrologic system. And then we can look at the locations that are extracting more groundwater than is naturally recharging. And that's how we would define the groundwater depletion. So we use a model called the PCR Globe WB model, which can do essentially this. And it's been used and validated in the US before for irrigation. So here we use the PCR model, and the map C shows changes over time. So here we're looking at a decade time span where it gets more red. There's actually more groundwater depletion over time. So Southern California, the Northern High Plains, and Northern Mississippi embayment, there's actually more volume that's being extracted than is being replaced in those locations over this decade of study. And then we can, again, combine this hydrological information with supply chain data to trace where this is going. So we combine the water volumes and look at it where it's moving around in our domestic agricultural supply chains. And that's what I'm showing in the left diagram. And here there's a lot of groundwater depletion, about 10 times more groundwater depletion incorporated in our domestic supply chain than international. The total volume on the left graph is 34.8 cubic kilometers. On the right, it's 3.7 cubic kilometers. So there's a much larger volume moving around domestically. And individual states actually are largely reliant on their own groundwater depletion. So that's what this sort of self loop that you see is highlighting. So California is sending a lot of groundwater depletion to itself. That might mean that it's growing produce, fruits and vegetables in the Central Valley with unsustainable groundwater, but then it's shipping it to another location within California, which might be canning tomatoes, and then sending those canned tomatoes elsewhere. So here we're just tracing the raw agricultural products. And also California is the largest state sending groundwater depletion abroad. So California is sending a lot of unsustainable groundwater in its agriculture to, say, East Asia, to Canada, and to other countries that the United States trades with. And then we can look at the total agricultural mass and the financial value in dollars that relies on unsustainable groundwater and see how it's changed over time. So here you can see on the left that the amount of mass, comparing the bars to blue and orange bars, those are actually going down over time. So less mass of crops in our supply chain is relying on groundwater depletion. But then when you look at the value, it's actually different. So that's going up. So the blue is increasing to orange in both our domestic supply chain and our exports. So in a way, this is heartening, because what does this mean? This means that farmers are choosing to use this scarce resource, this groundwater, to produce higher value agricultural crops, which is what you'd want. So say they're switching from grains in California and growing strawberries. So strawberries are very, high value. So they're re-optimizing to get the highest drop per dollar out of that water system. So in a way, that's what we'd want to be happening. We want the water to be going to the higher value uses, but then it does mean that, higher value items might be at risk in the future if we're not able to produce using this resource in the same way. So then finally, most of these results that I've shown you have been under sort of average climate conditions. And we were doing a lot of this during the last California drought, the drought of 2012 to 2016. So we wanted to ask, how does the situation with the California drought impact what's going on? And so we looked at a time series around the drought in particular. So 2011 was our pre-drought year in California. The last millennial drought in California started in 2012, lasted till about 2015, 16. So we looked, and here we only had data at this point until 2014. But we looked to see how did the water footprint or the virtual transfers out of California change around this drought window. And so here we can see that we're looking at the percent change. Red means negative, it went down. So we see that the rainwater and the surface water supplies incorporated in our domestic agricultural supply chain all went down. But we see that groundwater, so plot the map in C, those became more yellow and blue. So the amount of groundwater incorporated in the supply chains actually went up. So there's more groundwater that's enabling the supply chains to keep operating during a drought. So this, really highlights that groundwater can act as a buffer to surface droughts. There's not enough rainfall. There's not enough surface supplies, at least in locations that have conjunctive use. of irrigation, like California, where they have the ability to switch between surface and groundwater supplies in certain places. Then those farmers, particularly in the southern Central Valley, when they weren't going to receive the surface water supplies that they need, they could switch and pump groundwater. And that enabled agricultural production to continue and supply chains to continue operating. So in a way, we can see that groundwater is an important buffer. But then on the other hand, this also shows that we've continued unsustainable use of groundwater, which, continues to pose risks going forward if we don't level off that resource use. So this, my group has still been building on some of this work, and these are some of the things that we have in progress. So my student who actually just defended yesterday has been looking to determine, has been modeling the specific crops that rely on specific sources of water, surface water, groundwater, and unsustainable groundwater irrigation. So this, we envision, will actually be a companion to the USGS water use database, which provides sort of the gold standard water database of irrigation water use at the county level in the US. So we're going to be contributing to that and breaking it down by crop. So we'll know, the water used in each county. Did it go to alfalfa or corn or soy or a variety of crops that we're trying to estimate that for. And we're also interested in understanding how groundwater contributes to all supply chains. So not just agricultural and food supply chains, but how those products underpin a lot of other sectors of the economy, like industrial production and the service sector. So there we might need to use some other modeling approaches to understand that. And then we are, interested in digging in more to thinking about groundwater as a way to buffer agricultural production and supply chains during drought. So how do we figure out its value in that purpose? And here is some preliminary results for that study where we're looking at groundwater use by crop through time. So in the end, we will produce a freely accessible open access database that will look like this. It'll be county scale, and then we'll have a variety of crops and the amount of irrigation that they used by different sources that rely on those crops. So this is currently in review. Okay, but then it's about halfway through. I wanted to maybe just take a few minutes and see if anybody has any questions before we keep going.
Yeah, so members of the audience, you can type questions into Q&A, or if you're live, you can go to the microphone and ask Megan any questions. I see one in the Q&A now. Megan, just before I go to it, I'm wondering if you can comment on groundwater age or well depth and some of the sustainability issues. We had Tom Gleason on last week, and we talked a bit about groundwater age. Others have published some interesting papers. I'm thinking of Scott Giuseco suggesting that, 2/3 of the water below, I think it was 250 meters, was 10,000 years old or older. So the question is water age a good metric for sustainability from a, pumping for agriculture perspective?
That's a great question, and I haven't thought about that much before, but I imagine, I think it definitely would be largely a proxy for sustainability, because if you're drawing on water that hasn't been recharged in the last couple of decades, then it's you pretty easily classify that as unsustainable. I would think.
I'm also thinking about the recent work Deb Perrone has been publishing. Groundwater wells going deeper for agriculture, and of course deeper means older. maybe we can talk more at the end. I think there's a question in the room, and then we'll go to the Q&A on Zoom. So go ahead, live group.
Yeah, so my name is David Ferris. I'm a PhD student under the supervision of Jay Familietti. I just wanted to say that's a really great data set. It's very compelling to see these national figures covering the entire United States. But I have some questions, like what kind of data sets are you drawing from to produce this? I know that there's sometimes jurisdictional differences between how this data is recorded. Some states, maybe I'm guessing that some are more or less accurate. So what kind of data sets were you drawing from? What kind of challenges did you face in trying to integrate them? And what kind of certainty can you kind of speak to the certainty that you have on these kinds of numbers that we're seeing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and very valid. So we do draw from a lot of different databases, each which would have its own uncertainty that, unfortunately, as far as we're aware, has not been quantified. So we, would love to be able to percolate the uncertainty to our own results, but we haven't quite figured out a strategy for that because we don't have it for the underlying input data. But I think there is more, there are some databases might have more uncertainty than others, and some of the economic databases are census products. So every 5 years in the US, there's a very extensive survey done of manufacturers and producers where they pretty much sample, I think they might even ask every producer and exporter. So that's pretty comprehensive, and I think the uncertainty is lower on that data product. But we also do use the USGS water use database quite extensively, and there, as you mentioned, the states do have quite a bit of differences in how they collect and report their water use. Some states, Nebraska comes to mind, they meter pretty much all water users, and they have metered information on how water is being used. So they have very high sort of integrity in their water use estimates. But other states, I think it's very, very much estimated, might even just be estimated on climate, which I think can be problematic when you're talking about a variable like water use, which has a lot of human demand, behavioral and economic issues behind it, and you'd want more sort of under the hood than just climate, I think. But I know there's a pretty extensive effort going on right now for the USGS to improve their water use database, and I think in the next release or two of the data, that should be a lot better.
Good.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you. One of my pet projects is trying to see more data shared publicly and consistently. And I think this kind of work provides a good justification for arguing to government bodies to release their data. So it's really great. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
And I'll just add that we also are very committed to open data in my group, and pretty much all these papers, if you go into the supplementary information, or I'll share a link to a website, most of our research data is freely available with the paper. So we hope it can be useful and built upon by other researchers.
Great. So Megan, I'm not sure about your flow for the second half. We've got two other questions in the Q&A. You might want to take them now or later. What do you think?
I think I can take two more.
Okay. This one from John Porterfield. Will a tremendous number of small water catchments, including contouring, reduce impacts of increased water security, that is drought, and water excess flooding? Also, will increased groundwater and surface water assist farmers who experience shifts in legacy planting season due to weather instabilities accompanying climate change?
Okay, so let me try to address the first part. So it's about tilling in catchments as a drought management strategy. And I think that's definitely one strategy that that can be effective. And I don't, really work on that directly. So I couldn't really speak to how effective it would be compared to other drought mitigation efforts, but I think it's definitely one that should be in the suite of solutions. And then the second part, I think I've already forgotten that. Sorry.
Yeah, this idea of legacy planting season due to weather instabilities will increase groundwater, surface water, as somehow assist those farmers who are experiencing those shifts. Maybe this is a stationarity question. I'm not quite sure. Perhaps we could come back to that towards the end. Other questions are streaming in, and I don't want to use all your remaining time. Let's just one more question from John Gazelle for now. I'm wondering about the relationship between groundwater use and the energy required to pump it, and how that would be changing over time as groundwater becomes deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's a good point. And it sort of, gets at the heart of this physical versus economic scarcity that we talk about when it comes to groundwater resources, where, when I'm talking about sustainability, and when most hydrologists talk about sustainability, we're talking about where we're either depleting the stock or we're taking out more than we're recharging over a long period of time. That would be, and then eventually we'll reach a point where the aquifer doesn't have water physically left in it. So that would be physical water scarcity. But then there's also this other idea of economic scarcity, where there might be water, but it might just be so deep that it's too expensive to really access by pumping, depending on the energy prices and how deep it is. So that's another possibility, where if the water just, is there, but it's very deep and the energy prices are so high, it might be economically infeasible to access. That would be sort of, I think, this idea that you're getting at in that question.
Good. Well, maybe we'll stop there, and there are other questions, but we can come back to them later, if that makes sense. Megan?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Back to you.
Hopefully that helped get everyone's helped keep everyone's attention. All right.
Good.
So then now I just wanted to share some of the work we're doing to think specifically about the food supply chains. So when we've been digging into this work, trying to understand water footprints, how water is incorporated in agricultural production, the water footprints of our economic production in the US. We realized that we often had better data for water than we did for supply chains. So this sort of body of work came from that realization that there's some work that could be done to just understand our domestic supply chains. So that's the goal of this body of work here, is to try to map our domestic supply chains. So the goal is to develop a county scale map of our agricultural and food supply chains in the US. So we are motivated to do this because we think a spatially detailed map of these food flows will improve our understanding of a variety of things, like the critical infrastructure that supports our food security in the country. It will help us pinpoint any food supply chain vulnerabilities that might exist that we could hopefully target for infrastructure or investment. And also we could continue to look at the virtual water or any other embodied resources in these food flows. Water, you could look at nutrients or land or carbon emissions. And we have looked at some of the carbon emissions. But to do this modeling, we mostly draw on some complex network statistics, where we think of the food supply chain like a complex network, where the political units are nodes in a network, and the flows of food, agriculture between them is a link, a directed and weighted link. And so here's some prior work we did, where we looked at the food flows between states in the US. And so then they are ranked in descending order around the outer edge of the circle. So Illinois actually it moves the largest mass of agriculture and food around the country. So that's why it has the largest outer arc. So the red links emanating from Illinois is Illinois sending crops around the country. You can see the largest link is actually from Illinois to Louisiana. And so that's us sending grain largely down the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans, which is located in Louisiana, and then that's exported abroad. So then Louisiana is the second largest mover of food mass, but you can see it's mostly receiving food mass from other states. So it's receiving grain largely from elsewhere and then exporting that. So then this shows all the states ranked. So the Midwestern states are major exporters to key ports around the country. We can also look at these graphs that capture some patterns in complex networks. So here we're looking at B, which is betweenness centrality in a network, which tells you essentially how critical a node is to the structure of a network. So if there's one node connecting like two clusters, that node would have really high centrality. And then K is the connectivity. So how many other states that state is connected with. And so when you look at these two metrics in a network and you plot them in B, you can see this pattern where those values start to level off. And this helps you identify what's known as a core in a network. So these are really important nodes in your network that are highly central and also highly connected. So you can think that these would be places that you might want to target because the network might be vulnerable to disruption here. So you want to make sure that your core is functioning. And so then that was a pattern that we saw based on statistical data, government databases within the US. And so then that led us to ask a question, is that a universal pattern? Do we see that in all food networks that we can find data for? So we essentially collected data at the global scale. So in A, we look at global food trade data. B is this database that we use a lot in the US called the Commodity Flow Survey. So it's the movement of goods within the US. And then in C, we also found household sharing of food in 3 Alaskan villages. And we think that these represent pretty much the full spatial extent of food supply chains that you can have. And then the main takeaway from this slide is that essentially the statistical distributions across these vastly different spatial scales are the same. So in particular, this second column here for mass flux, the data is shown with the histogram, and then the line we were able to fit to the data in each case was a gamma distribution. So in each case, the mass moving in the system follows a gamma distribution, which means that most nodes move or trade very small amounts of mass, but there are some outlier nodes that are trading disproportionately large amounts of mass in the system. And so we draw upon this sort of understanding to take information or data that we have at what's called the FAF spatial scale, which is essentially a combination of states in the US and major cities. So there's 132 spatial units in this database, and we want to downscale it to the county's spatial scale. And so many of us might be familiar with downscaling in sort of physical variables. It's commonly done using satellite imagery. You might have a coarse grid, and you want to assign the attributes of that coarse grid to smaller grids within it. But here it's actually a little bit more complicated than spatial downscaling that we might be familiar with in hydrology or satellite imagery, which would be what on the left side here, where we're taking this blue box and we want to assign attributes to these smaller boxes. Here what we have is actual flow information or a link between the two blue boxes, and we want to allocate the links to the smaller boxes that make up those blue rectangles. So this actually gets computationally demanding because this problem scales as n times n minus 1, where n is the number of small boxes in your system. And so since we're interested in trying to estimate flows between counties in the US, there's about 3,100 counties. So we have to estimate flows for 3,100 times 3,099. So it ends up being about 9.7 million links that we have to estimate, and that's for each food commodity. So it becomes a somewhat computationally demanding problem. So I won't, go too much into the methods here, but we did develop a new algorithm, a new method to do this, where we essentially combine supervised learning, which is a type of machine learning, to use a variety of statistical regressor variables to estimate the amount of flow. Also linear programming. So if two locations are closer to each other, we're more likely, all else equal, we're more likely to assign food flows between them. Mass balance. So the counties within the larger states have to add up to those states. And also taking advantage of the empirical patterns that I showed you earlier for the network properties, we ensure that our flows also follow a gamma mass flux distribution, because we saw that was evident in all the other locations that we have data. So then here's some results. So the top row shows the database that we're drawing from. So we have inflows, outflows, and then our estimated results are in the bottom row. So we do maintain spatial patterns, largely, by design with our algorithm, where we do have mass balance as a constraint. But now we can estimate the flows at those smaller counties. And then we can also do the same thing for the actual links. So here we have the links that we have to estimate between all nodes in our network. So A is showing the network map for the course or database that we have, and then B is representing that what we estimated between counties. So we do keep a lot of the same trends. So there's a lot of movement from California to the grain belt, north-south along the Mississippi, north-south along the Eastern Rockies. But then we can see some locations popping up as more important that might have been masked in the more coarse database, such as California counties are moving a lot of food. Also, this county on the border with Canada, but on New York Canadian border, there's an international overland port here, so that shows up as being important. So we can start sort of getting a finer understanding, finer spatial scale understanding of where of how food is moving around in the country. So that was a model that we developed, and then we've been doing a lot to build on that in the last year or so. And then these are just a few things I wanted to share with you, where we have come up with a interactive visualization system for this, because when this study came out, there were a lot of individual community groups or decision makers that wanted to see what the data looked like for their specific county. So now we built this website where you can go click on a county and it will just show you all the other counties that each county is connected with. I'll pull up an example of that shortly. We've extended this analysis in time for all years that we have the available data. Unfortunately, not only 3 years for that. And then we've been focusing on just the cold chain commodities, or those that require refrigeration. So here's what this website looks like. And if you're interested in this data, I encourage you to go and explore it. And you can also download the full, it's about 70 million data points are available on this website. But this is what you'd see. You could click on, I click on Champaign County, and then it shows me all the other counties that Champaign is sending and receiving food with. And then you could dig in more and see which food items and is it sending or receiving it. And it's a good way to, if you're just interested in a few places, to see what's going on. And then we've also done some work looking at the food supply chain over time. Here's the total mass in those years. And so, less mass was moving around in 2012. And that's because it was a major drought year in the US Corn Belt. So there was less production, less grain to send around the country and also to send abroad. So that's why 2012 is lower. And then it's rebounded to a higher level in 2017. But then with some of these time series data, we can look at things like changes around the drought. So here we're showing how the counties changed how they decreased the amount of grain that they're sending or increased the amount of grain that they're receiving in the grain belts before and after the drought. So you can start looking at some of these patterns. And then we can also, what we've done is tried to dig in for some refrigerated food transportation. So here we're looking at refrigerated trucking of meat and other prepared foodstuffs. And then here we're looking at the carbon emissions associated with those food systems. So it's an example of some of the environmental footprints that you can look at now that we have this finely resolved database. And again, yeah, just want to thank my students for all their hard work and leading these studies. And then I can open the floor up to any more questions. And this is how you could contact me if you were interested.
Excellent. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Let's go directly to questions. We'll start with Grant Ferguson and work our way back up. There have recently been, I'm not sure if you can see these. I'm not sure if it's best for me to read them. Perhaps for the audience, it'd be useful for me to read them. There have recently been a few papers co-authored with Tom Gleason, Deb Perrone, Mark Cuthbert, Jen McIntosh, questioning how we define sustainable groundwater use. Recharge minus pumping doesn't always equal depletion due to stream flow capture relationships. Groundwater age is often a function of flow system size and the position with the system more than anything else. We landed on groundwater levels and maintaining base flow as important metrics for sustainable use rather than recharge-based metrics. How might this framework change some of your results? Is the question.
Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, I think, sometimes those are harder outcome variables to model. So that, especially for agriculture, because often with agriculture, you're interested in understanding the demand of crops for water. So you're modeling evapotranspiration. And so trying to also link that in with, I think for stream flow, you'd have to have it coupled with we often don't really use a three-dimensional groundwater model for that. So I think you'd have to couple some of the models we use with like a mod flow based model. So it might become more computationally demanding. And I think it sounds definitely valid. I would just say there's aquifers that are never connected to the surface. And so they don't contribute to base flow. There's deep aquifers that don't have a surface water connection. So that might not be the best proxy of sustainable use for those aquifers. But the shallower aquifers that, do have a connection with the land surface, that, probably does make sense. I'd have to think about that more. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure if Grant can speak into the mic if that facility exists, but I know he's working actively on some of those deep waters that might be below, say, 500 meters, so quite deep, and finding that I think his statistic was something like less than 0.1%, certainly less than 1% ever makes its way back to a stream. So quite isolated, compartmentalized. Going up on the question line here and looking also to the room if there's any further questions in the live audience. Here's one from Sobhan. Is it a good sign that the value increased from 2000 to 2010? Maybe high food prices caused this delay due to less supply. I think he's referring to your first half of the talk with the groundwater graphs. Yeah, it's true that high food prices wouldn't be good for certain things like food security for sure. But in California, I think a lot of the work we did kind of around the drought showed that it was farmers either fallowing lands that were low value. So in California, they often fallowed grain crops and then grew produce crops instead, which are higher
higher value goods. I think I have a supplemental slide that I might pull up here just to show this. But so here, this is showing during the drought. I'm not sure why the color on this one is not showing up, but what you'd see here is that farmers actually started fallowing annual crops or non-permanent crops. So these are like the field crops. And then, so the orange bars are actually going down, and then the green bars should be going up, which are the permanent crops. So you might have heard about California, they were growing more almond trees, growing more vine crops. So these are perennials or permanent crops. So, but these are also more high value crops. So this was what we saw based on the agricultural census data in California, how farmers were changing what they grow in response to less available water to, I think, optimize the money they could make, the profit they could make. But so, that makes sense. But then this other issue, which I didn't raise earlier, is this has the effect of drought hardening, because being able to fallow crops is actually one way that farmers can adapt when there is a drought. They can just not grow anything. They don't have the water available to irrigate. But now, if they have invested all this money planting trees, planting vines, then they're going to be less willing to let those die. So this is a large investment that they'll want to keep irrigating in future droughts. So this is known as drought hardening. But then here's showing that some of the, here the blue water showing the water footprint requirements for different crops compared with their revenue per hectare. So there was typically a shift to some of these higher value crops, which do have more water requirements, but there was, a shift, like something like hay has very low revenue, but also a high water footprint. So, shifting from something like hay to some of these nut crops, I think at least is partly responsible for that increased water per dollar over time. Yeah, it's a good point. Good question.
Yeah, I certainly see the Willamette Valley in Oregon going to almost exclusively hazelnuts. The plantations are going in at an incredible rate, probably for similar reasons you're describing. Other comments, questions, either into the chat or in the live audience? Go ahead, David.
Hi, yeah, David Ferris again. I'm thinking about the metrics that we're using to measure what we're talking about in crop production, and dollar value is valuable so people can use water to effectively produce more revenue. I'm thinking in terms of how we feed people, though. Have you seen any movement towards, instead of using dollar value, using nutritional content or caloric content? That way we can sort of develop policies to optimize how we feed people instead of profits. Have you seen a movement like that? And do you think the data might exist to produce that kind of metric?
Yeah, Paulo Dodorico's group several years ago did some work where they looked at the virtual, or I think they might have looked at the water per calorie or the virtual calories. So they have done some work in this realm, and there are some people looking at nutrients. I guess my only, sort of caution about moving that way is, farmers aren't optimizing for calories they produce, they're optimizing for profit. So if you want to incentivize enough, an available food supply, I think you're going to have to think about the producers, not just the consumers. So price is really what connects producers and consumers in the food system. We're seeing that with the disruption in Ukraine right now, where there's a large chunk of grain missing in our global grain supplies, but farmers around the world are responding by planting wheat because they anticipated that wheat prices would go up and they'd be able to make a profit. So I think, farmers are producers, they respond to price incentives. So I think it's important to also think about, not just the consumers, but the producers. But yeah, it's important to also think about food security, and all these issues are interlinked. So it's a good point.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Megan, I thought in this last set of slides, I might see the Costco effect appearing. There were those intense colors at the Canadian border at a couple of places. You noted one in Ontario. Vancouver looks strong as well. You know, we shop in Saskatoon, we shop in the Western US, we shop in Mexico. It's you go into the store, and if you were blindfolded going in, you wouldn't know if you were in a different country or different state. Just wondering about that as the way in which large corporations like Costco are moving food around, and also between Canada, the US, and Mexico. I don't know how that fits into, maybe it's a small number in the scheme of things, but I am struck at how Costco is kind of aligned, at least north-south through North America, the food supply through their stores.
Yeah, and Costco's big in England as well. That's what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And I'd say our results are more applicable to sort of a national food system model. So, for example, President Biden had an executive order a few months ago asking us to understand vulnerabilities in certain critical supply chains like semiconductors, and agriculture was one of them. So I think our results could be used to address something more like that. Yeah. But we don't have the actual firm level or corporate supply chains. But I'd love to eventually collaborate with and get my hands on some firm level supply chain data, because I think it has a slightly different structure that we could find some interesting things. It's more hierarchical, I think, in firm level supply chains. Ours is more based on a national transportation system and where the producers and consumers are. But yeah, it's good. It's really interesting.
Excellent. Well, Megan, on behalf of all of us, thanks so much for your time today. It was really outstanding pair of seminars together and very enjoyable.